new government guidelines on free speech at university campuses. They were published over the weekend. Dawn, are those guidelines necessary?
I don't think so. I think it's a problem that's been completely blown out of proportion. I was at university 10 years ago. We had discussions about no platform policies then. And, for the most part, most people didn't really care very much about who was or wasn't invited onto universities. And I think that, for the most part, students should be left to just decide on, for their own, for the 3 years they're there. And actually, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy whereby every time there's a big fuss, more and more students try and get involved. And actually, a lot of people, I think, do quite enjoy being disinvited because they then get invited onto TV a lot.
Oh, what, for publicity? Not worth your while putting the government guidelines out?
Well, I'm not sure that's true. There's obviously been significant concern about how free speech is being interpreted and how it's landing on campuses. And so, my ministerial colleagues felt the need to put out guidelines. They are only guidelines, it's not legislation. It's a kind of best practice, here's how you should behave. But I mean, Dawn's quite right, campus should be a robust place. I can remember many years ago going to a talk at the LSE when Ken Clark was Chancellor, and the stage essentially being stormed by LSE students. I had to throw myself between him and the crowd. Not that he ever remembers or thanked me, but there you are. I
hope you're listening, Ken Clark.
So it should be a place for robust exchange, but it's definitely the case that there are people who express fear and intimidation on campus, and that's a pity.
Well, let's have a look at the Daily Mail have run this story from the former Equalities Chief Trevor Phillips. Rule of the mob is curbing free speech in universities. Is that your experience, Stella?
Well, I look at the report from Parliament on this. I actually look at your own BBC fact checker, and the reality is there's a big difference between the numbers of people who might write about it, who might make great careers, get invited on the shows, and the actual evidence of it. There's nothing really new in these guidelines. So I think we all have to be a little bit less snowflake about the idea that there is some big concern about it and a bit more focused on research. After all, surely that's what universities should be teaching people to do, to look for the evidence and fact in this. And the evidence and fact is it's not actually a big deal.
Right, but what's not a big deal? Because some high-profile speakers have been no-platformed. Germaine Greer,
no, she wasn't.
Peter Tatchell.
That's a good example.
But they were
she was. There was actually a discussion about it, and she still went and gave her speech. So for all the people talk about it, actually, Germaine Greer did go and give her speech. So there's a different disjuncture between what is talked about in the papers and the Daily Mail. It makes great column inches, and actually what is happening in our university.
Right, so these people are not being no-platformed?
No, Germaine Greer wasn't.
Right. I mean, where do you stand on this, Nick?
I think Trevor Phillips has probably got it about right, actually. I think there was a bit of a danger of the rule of the mob. I take on board what Stella says, and I've been in the newspaper industry, as indeed all my lives, and of course they're going to write it up to give it a little bit more. But I would say that I thought universities were places for learning where you're meant to have your mind broadened. Sometimes you're going to hear things maybe you don't want to. As long as it's not downright offensive, as long as it's not being rude or obscene or vile, then it should be allowed to proceed.
But that's the line, isn't it? It's very difficult, that line, to adjudicate. I mean, who is going to judge as to whether something is hate speech or whether something is free speech?
Well, generally, the students judge, and part of student politics, if you like, part of student life is students expressing their opinion, and somebody's coming to campus where they perhaps they might want to campaign about it or have some kind of peaceful, respectful protest. Well, I mean, that's great. That's what we need to be encouraging, that. And so I just think that it's a bit heavy-handed. I mean, there's nothing that's in the guidance that's particularly problematic. It seems like fairly good common sense that students should be able to decide, and clearly there's some circumstances where you can't ban whole tranches of people because of a characteristic. But sometimes students will say, we don't want this person on our campus, and it's up to them. If
I mean, Trevor Phillips goes on to say that the no platform policy, and I take your point that if in the end, because there was a lot of discussion about it, Germaine Greer wasn't actually no platformed, that it's being used in an authoritarian way, and actually what you need are the institutions themselves and vice chancellors to get involved in the discussions. I'm just going to put that to the door. Sorry.
Well, I think they are, and I think a lot of lecturers have been involved, etc. I just don't see why it needs to be so heavy-handed and to come from government and to actually threaten universities, saying you may be breaking the law if you do this. If you actually look at the report as well, it says that for all the talk about safe spaces infringing on freedom of speech, there's actually very little evidence that this is happening whatsoever. So it seems very heavy-handed. It seems to be blown it out of all proportion, and I just think that in itself seems far too authoritarian.
There's also a little bit of inconsistency here, because rightly there are people challenging and about, say, extremist preachers and organisations like the Henry Jackson Society saying, oh, hang on a minute, universities are having
it's
to,
only
but
guidance.
also saying that these people...
It is only guidance.
Where the answer lies, Nick, and I hope that you'll take part in it, is that the government is now reviewing all hate crime legislation in this country and looking at these issues around freedom of speech, around courses of behaviour. So get involved in that consultation, Nick. Have your say. I'd love to hear what you
about
think.
The protection of minority views, right? The minority views being expressed on campus quite often, and we've seen this in other parts of the world, right, where minority views being expressed can be, effectively university authorities lose courage in the face of a kind of mass campaign to have something stopped. And if just a little bit of guidance gives them courage to make some space for minority views, however controversial, then to me that's part of the university process.
All right, well, let's look at something else which is sort of related, which is Turning Point UK.